I got it. All right, let's start our Bible class this morning. I hope you guys had a great week. Someone say cold? We're in our class on marriage. Still, we're getting to. Are we at the halfway point? I think we are. This lesson it'll be one more lesson. We'll be at the halfway. So almost at the halfway point. We've looked at 2 commitments so far that every couple needs to make in order to thrive. The first one was, we will put into action a regular lifestyle of confession and forgiveness. We talked about what that process looks like and how important confession and forgiveness is to marriage. The second commitment, do I have these slides? Yeah. The second commitment is we will make growth and change our daily agenda. And we used the gardening illustration here of pulling weeds and planting good seeds, and how that is a must in marriage. And our third commitment that we're going to look at today, I would like to illustrate by having us look at Genesis chapter 22, a story that I would think a lot of us are familiar with at least, but I want to read verses 1 through 14 of this accounting here of Abraham and Isaac. It says this in Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And so they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said today, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now I know it sounds ominous to introduce our third commitment with a story of a potential human sacrifice in the context of marriage here. But what are some lessons that we learn from this section of Scripture? What do we learn from this story? Or what do you learn from it? What are your takeaways? Trust and obedience. Very good. Anything, Rod?
Be willing to give up something else?
Be willing to sacrifice, right? For God. True. Yeah, Marshall?
I think it's pretty interesting. I've never thought of it, but just curious if Isaac was able to hear the angel or whoever, talk from heaven. But I think just watching in a relationship like that, watching your significant other display that amount of faith would be pretty deep. Something like that.
Watching your significant other display a great amount of faith, for sure. Absolutely. Anything else? I mean, there's a bunch of different directions that we can go in with the story of Abraham and Isaac, and there's a lot to be learned here. But I think the thing that kind of astounds me when I read through this story is the amount of trust that Abraham had in God. That even through it all, I mean, Abraham, he's definitely had his highs and his definite lows in his attempts of following God. But in this one, I think we could truly say that he didn't waver for an instant, at least not from what we see here in the text. And now there might be some rather large turmoil going on in his mind. I mean, it would be mine if I was asked to do the same thing of, man, I really hope God pulls through here. I'm going to trust him. But this seems like a lot. But this story and this message of trust is then echoed through the rest of the Bible. You think of Joseph trusting God through all of the difficult times that he endured. Moses trusting God that he made the right decision of making Moses the liberator of the people. Israel then as a nation trusting God in the time of the judges and then losing trust and then trusting again and then losing that trust and then trusting again, right? The cycle that we see repeated through the time of the judges. Naomi and Ruth trusting God when you feel alone. Saul's refusal to trust God in the time of the kings, and then David's reliance on doing things God's way. Esther trusting God to act even when she was afraid. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusting God no matter the outcome. And the apostles learning to trust in Jesus. And they call it faith. Right? That's what faith is. It's trust. Actually trusting that God will do what he says he will do. In Hebrews 11:1, it talks about faith. It says, so now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's trust, right? If God says it's there, but we can't see it, then we have to trust him in the fact that it is what he says it is. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, it says, we walk by faith, not by sight. And that involves a great amount of trust. Hebrews 11, verse 6, it says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he rewards those who seek him. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. How important is trust or faith in the life of a believer? Vital. It says it's impossible to please God without faith. And likewise, in our marriage of sorts between the church and Jesus requires trust, requires faith, likewise in our earthly marriages as well. The third commitment is this. We will work together to build a sturdy bond of trust. How important is trust to a marriage? What do you think? Most important.
Call it a bedrock principle for marriage.
A bedrock principle.
Yeah, because you commit so much to each other.
You commit so much to each other. You entrust, right? You entrust the other person with a lot of responsibility, secrets, vulnerability. How important is trust to a marriage? Again, I would say it's vital, right? Yeah.
If you don't have trust, do you truly have a marriage?
That's a great question to ask. Because I would say that many people headed towards divorce, their levels of trust would be very low. But here's the thing. We say, it's a bedrock principle, it's vital, it's desperately needed for a marriage to survive. You need trust. But what about forgiveness? Is trust any more vital than the principles of forgiveness in your marriage? No. Right? What about weeding and planting that we talked about last week? No, they are all vital. And when you understand that, you start to understand the phrase, marriage is difficult. It's not any one thing. As long as we can get trust figured out, then we're fine, because there's other matters at play as well. Marriage is difficult primarily because it's not any one thing. It is forgiveness. It is weeding and planting. It is trust. And the vital aspects of marriage don't stop here. Like I said, we're only halfway through this course. There are going to be 3 other commitments that we're going to talk about. And in marriage, you can't be a one-trick pony. You have to work at and cultivate all these areas because they have the tendency to lose their luster if they aren't polished every now and then. My question, Scott, go ahead.
It's a common thread throughout the Bible that parents need to raise their children. They have to be actively raising their children. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what was required of the Jews under the old law, and then what we need to do in raising our children to have them be ready to basically accept the gospel, to obey the gospel. There's one common thing: they have to learn to be selfless. If you're not raised with an understanding that to get along in society, and more so to be a part of a family and of a church, you have to learn how to be selfless. And if you're not taught that, you have no chance of marriage. It's going to be really a tough struggle. Yeah. And so, that's kind of very important for us to do with children.
I think it's very important for us now that are in the process of raising our kids. But I wouldn't say it's impossible, because you can learn selflessness. You can learn to be trustworthy. But it takes work. Especially if you were born into a cycle of distrust or disharmony in your life. It's going to take work to break that cycle. Rod?
I was going to say we need to realize these are commitments in a Christian marriage, because you can have a marriage where none of these would apply, where the husband is the Lord over the wife, and she doesn't have any choice in the matter. The laws are on his side.
Yeah. I would say, Rod, that these principles, most of these principles, are going to be found in a healthy marriage, regardless if it's Christian or not. The kicker, though, is that these gospel commitments are kind of placed upon us as Christians, that we should be better at them. We should be good at them. But oftentimes, like I just said, if we don't take them out and polish them every once in a while, they're going to lose their luster, and we will get distracted. Yes, ma'am.
The other thing, the thread that keeps going through for me is we are the bride of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And every bit of these commitments are what we should be having with Christ as well.
Absolutely.
So if we can maintain that, we should be able to maintain that.
And I think that's the beautiful thing about when we get into the New Testament and we get that illustration, or we then realize that this illustration that we've been given is something that it has a truer nature to it. That it's not just marriage that God established. He established this relationship to teach us something about our relationship to God. Right? And so that when we go through the Bible and we read certain things, we go, well, that can be applied to marriage, and that shouldn't shock us, because the two relationships mirror each other, and we should take note of that. But considering that, what does trust in marriage look like? Think about your marriage. What does it actually look like? When do you see it?
I just have this joke that I will, like when talking about marriage stuff with people, I mean, the thing is that Zach and I, we're literally like, if I went and just took the Armada and traded it in one day, and came home from work, it was a different car, he'd be like, oh, I guess that was a good decision. So, like, he would never get upset about it, because he would trust that,
Trust you.
yeah, like, not that I would do that, but that is literally like, that would be his response. You know what I mean? When somebody else might not, that might not fly over too well.
Yeah. We're going to talk about the Armada situation here in a little bit, but it's called the Armada principle.
Just trust, like, not getting bent out of shape about stuff, just trusting that, like, yeah,
That's your first response to seeing it,
Yeah.
not the negative.
yeah, it's, okay, you must have had a reason for doing it, you know?
What does trust look like in your marriage? Or, I mean, how do you know that you have it? I mean, the Armada principle is a good one. Exactly. That's a good one.
We can do anything like that.
Eric?
If that kind of trust is there, the spouse who's receiving all that trust has to make sure that he doesn't put himself in situations where he doesn't trust himself as well. And that would be, if you do struggle with something, don't put yourself there. If someone's trusting you, do not do it.
That's almost like, I don't know, making good on that trust that they're giving you, or living up to that, right? Not to say that we won't fail. We've talked about that before, and that we live in a fallen world, and our failures and weaknesses and struggles with sin are going to affect our marriage from time to time. But then that's when the principles of forgiveness and confession come in, and so that trust can then be rebuilt. You see how these things work together? Scott?
I could be out running errands, and if I'm longer than I said I would be, I might get a text from Caroline saying, "What's going on? Where are you?" There's an expectation that when you're married, you're connected. Even spiritually when you're not together. And that would be one aspect.
Yeah, but she's not texting you because she doesn't trust where you are. She's
Right,
texting you because
that's
she
right.
cares.
You need to get that.
Yeah, because I was thinking the exact opposite. People who don't trust are constantly having to check in with one another because there isn't a trust.
So if you're out and your spouse does not text you, that means they trust you. Like, look how much trust they have in me. They don't even text me. Here's a working definition that we can use here. What is trust? It's being so convinced that you can rely on the integrity, the strength, the character, and faithfulness of another, that you are willing to place yourself in his or her care. And when you think about that day, when you said those vows before God and your family and your friends, you are making this commitment, right? To place yourself in the care of the other person and to care for him or her in return. And like Troy said, no trust, no marriage. It just simply can't work. You can have cohabitation without trust. You can have a quid pro quo type of relationship without trust, but the one flesh type of intimate, vulnerable, and mutually cooperative union that the Bible talks about cannot happen without trust. It just simply won't. And so, if you're wondering, I wonder how much trust I have in my marriage, worry not, because I have a test. It's 12 questions. And we're going to walk through them. You don't have to answer it now, but I wanted, some of these questions are a little bit wordy, and I know not everyone is, ready and ready to write things down, but I wanted you to have these at least to take with you, and if at least it might be a resource that you can share with someone else. And these things work, I would say most of them work in not just in a marriage context. Hayden, can you pass those over there? Thank you, sir. Very good, John. Look at you. Look at you. So eager. I love it. Very good. And can you disseminate those around here? Thank you. So, 12 questions. We're going to go through them one at a time. Hopefully we have enough time left in this class. But this is a good test of trust in your relationship. There might be ones where you're absolutely 100% trust in this area. There might be other ones where it's I think, that happens. From time to time. And maybe depending on your last argument with your spouse, one might hit home a little more than the others. But here's your test. Number 1, is there more unity, understanding, and love in your marriage now than there has ever been? When there is a strong bond of trust, the intimacy of marriage grows. And I'm not talking about necessarily romantic intimacy here, but just being around each other, deepening that relationship on all different levels. Trust allows a couple to work through differences and build unity. They are one, right? It's like this whole idea of one flesh. You can't think of one flesh without the concept of unity. And trust allows you to work to understand your spouse and to know that he or she will work to understand you. Trust won't alleviate all your problems and differences, but it will give you a means of dealing with them. In 2 Corinthians 13, verse 11, I have a few scriptures here to go along with some of these. With some of these questions. And you'll note that these aren't necessarily talking about marriage. In fact, I don't think any of them are explicitly talking about marriage, but more the character of what it means to be a Christian. In 2 Corinthians 13, verse 11, it says, "Finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration. Comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you." And this term for aim insinuates continual action. It's not like, all right, I'm going to aim for this and try to shoot for it once. It's a lifelong pursuit of aiming for restoration, comforting one another, and agreeing with one another. That means unity, right? Is there more unity, understanding, and love in your marriage now than there has ever been? If not, why not? Number 2, do you both do what you promised in the time that you have promised? I'm guilty for this one right here because Alicia, she'll have her honey-do list, and some of those things are things that I might not necessarily like to do. I'm pretty good at the whole, clean the toilet, the normal chores, but when it comes to, all right, we need to, tear out the tile in the bathroom and re-grout and retile the whole thing, that one's very easily gets shipped to the back burner of, I'll get to it someday, eventually, right? But when you think about this, do you both do what you promised in the time that you have promised it? If you love your spouse, you will take your promises to them seriously. And most of these promises, like we talked about in the weeding or gardening area the last 2 weeks, aren't the huge life-altering promises. The things that have the biggest ability to degrade or erode at the foundation of your marriage is the small day-to-day little moment promises of safety, security, and welfare. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5:37, he says, simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more comes from evil. Jesus is saying, be a man or a woman of your word. If you say you're going to do it, then do it. And you can see how that can, again, erode the trust in your marriage. Yeah, Casey. 5, hold on, 37. Number 3, are you attentive to what your spouse sees as important? We can think of all sorts of different and weird things that become our hobbies or become important to us. And it's very easy just to kind of put that off to the side and it's like, oh, that's her thing. No interest in yarn, right? Or the size of crochet hooks, or the fact that this one was made out of this certain wood and that one was made out of plastic. No interest in that, right? But Alicia views those things as highly important, as like, oh, look at this yarn, and look at this, and it's not that I'm feigning my excitement, but I'm excited about it because she's excited about it. And if that brightens her day, then I'm going to do my job to ask curious questions, or to mirror her excitement of and suppress in my head of, I wonder how much this cost. Because those questions, and I'm not saying that it's like, oh, you should just let your spouse spend whatever they want, right? But if they are excited about something, oftentimes we find it very easy for us to become self-absorbed and self-focused in the things that we view as important, and don't shed any of that energy towards our spouse. It's easy to be captured by your own schedule and your own interests, but love is about opening yourself to your spouse and their interests. Love means committing yourself to care about what they care about, to be interested in the thing simply because it interests them. In Luke chapter 12, verse 7, Jesus is talking about how God cares for us and he gives attention to us. Luke 12, verse 7, it says, why? Even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are more valuable, you are of more value than many sparrows. And the fact that God, the God of the universe, the God that is receiving prayers from millions of people simultaneously and keeping everything working the way that it should work, and the fact that he was the creator of not just the insignificant little gnat, but he's the creator of the cosmos themselves, wants to take an interest into our lives, I think is fascinating. That he cares about me individually amongst everything else. And if we are trying to be godly in our marriages, and if God takes an interest in us, then we owe it to take an interest in our spouses. Number 4, do you make excuses for failures to do what you have promised, or are you ready to confess? Self-righteousness, inapproachability, defensiveness, and self-excusing are all toxic to trust and therefore toxic to marriage. self-righteousness, inapproachability, defensiveness. You will not entrust yourself to your spouse if they are defensive and unapproachable. And you will not trust your spouse if in a time of failure they are unwilling to look at themselves. Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And to act as if that weren't true, as if we were somehow, God's gift to humanity, and we are somehow above that rule and law, it's toxic. And it will erode your marriage. Number 5, do you listen well to your spouse and act on what you heard? Now, there are 2 different terms in that question that I think the difference between the two are vitally important. What is the difference between hearing and listening? Is there a difference, Aaron?
I think about my children. I feel like they hear me a lot, but sometimes they are not, or oftentimes they're not listening.
Yeah. Mom's making some racket over there. Seems like she's really animated about something. What it is, I gotta tell you. Right? Experience that, yeah. Kids are a great example of that. I'm sure they hear me. I mean, sometimes it's like, I know you're hearing me because I'm like, 3 inches from your face. You have to be hearing me. Or are you listening? Right? Listen. There is probably no marital pain that I have expressed, that I've heard expressed more frequently than the pain of not being heard. Every single couple that I counsel and comes into my office, if we don't talk about communication in the very first session, that would be an anomaly. Because it's so prevalent everywhere. He never listens to me, or he's not hearing what I'm trying to say, and it works vice versa, right? I've sat with couples who they just go around in circles, right? It's like, well, he doesn't listen to me, she doesn't listen to me, and then no one is listening to anyone in this relationship, and you wonder why things are falling apart. One of the most amazing things that God promises to you and to me is that He will never turn a deaf ear to our cries. You can run to God with no fear whatsoever as to whether He will listen to you. In Psalm 34, verse 17, it says, when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. Psalm 34, 17. You notice that this, my version here says the Lord hears, right? Well, is it hearing or listening? We know that it's listening because then God acts on that. He acts on what He heard. He delivers them out of all their troubles. And if you're struggling with this, or maybe you hear your spouse say this often of, do you remember we talked about this? Or were you listening to me? Or if you find yourself in the midst of your conversation, typically this happens to me late at night, that I'm thinking in my head, man, if I were given a quiz right now of the things that Alicia just said in the last 3 minutes, I don't know if there's one question that I could get right. Because we get distracted. And then communication breaks down. We are hearing but not listening. Scott, what were you going to say?
There's an advertising campaign going on right now where there's a couple of the examples that a couple is arguing about what actually happened in a previous conversation. And in a sports context, they say, can we do a review of this?
I like the challenge
And they
of
go
that.
back.
I love those commercials.
And so they give you, kind of show you what went wrong there.
Yeah.
And you learn from that.
Just screamed like a girl. No, I didn't. I got one challenge left. I love that. I love those commercials. Number 6, do you follow through with mutually agreed upon plans? Planning in marriage, whether it's large or small, is what marriage is all about. It's the life plan of two people colliding and becoming one plan. God's goal for marriage is that a husband and wife would live in a relationship so deeply blended and unified that it could only be called one flesh. Right? Number 7, do you share with your spouse your thoughts, desires, hopes, dreams, and concerns? Or is it easier for you to be quiet or to share them with someone else? Have you learned that you can say anything to your spouse because they approach you with a heart that is gentle, kind, understanding, and patient? This is the Armada principle, Zach, right here. Or has your spouse not taken your concerns seriously? Or have you been dismissive of your spouse's thoughts, hopes, or dreams? Do you find it easier that you can talk candidly with someone other than your husband or your wife? And when someone outside the house has become a replacement confidant for your spouse, it's a sure sign that trust has been broken. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have other trusted confidants outside of your house, but when they become a replacement for your spouse, it's a sure sign that something is broken. Is there any evidence that you have withdrawn from the other in protective distance? Are you afraid to disagree with them? Are you afraid to lovingly confront or contradict them? Are you afraid of what would happen if you told them what you really think? There's no getting around it. Withdrawal is a sure sign of a lack of trust. Number 9, do you ever wonder what the other is doing when they're not with you? Scott, this is what you're talking about. Or Caroline, and texting the other. The need to follow them, check up on them, and to cross-examine them when they return is a sure indicator that you do not trust them. And now that can go many different ways, and the way in which you do that kind of shows your motives there, right? Because you can be very caring and concerned of like, I just didn't know where you're going. I want to make sure that you're okay. But you can also be just as accusatory with that as well, saying, "Where were you? Really, you were there?" And stuff like that, right? So how you deliver this one, I think, determines the context greatly. Number 10, is your sexual relationship mutually satisfying, or is it hard for you to give yourself physically to your spouse? What does sex have to do with trust? Everything. Sexual dysfunction is directly related to trust. When you think about the marriage bed, it is quite literal, a quite literal, naked and vulnerable moment. And unless we trust each other, we are not likely to do either. Number 11, are you comfortable with the vulnerability that a good marriage involves? You can't have a relationship without vulnerability. And the reason vulnerability is called vulnerability is that it requires risk. Are you willing to stick your neck out and be vulnerable because you know that your spouse will care for you when you do? The opposite illustration of that is when you stick your neck out, your spouse is sharpening their sword to make a swift cut. In 2 Corinthians 6, verses 11 through 13, Paul here is the perfect example of vulnerability when he's talking to these Christians as if they were his own kids. He says, "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. Are you not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections? In return, I speak to you as children. Widen your hearts also." And that illustration, Paul's saying, I'm here just laying everything out to bear here because I love you, Corinthians here. He's being vulnerable to show them what it looks like. so that they might also widen their hearts. Are you comfortable with the vulnerability that a good marriage involves? And lastly, do you ever fear that you're being manipulated or taken advantage of in any way? If you ever come to a place where you actually fear the other person, then you are in a situation where there has been a complete breakdown of trust. If your companion has become your adversary, then trust is gone and the marriage cannot work. And that doesn't mean that the marriage is over, it simply means that it needs to fundamentally change and heal. So, this is where we start with the third commitment. We will work together to build a sturdy bond of trust. And trust is like one of those things that it's hard to quantify. Hopefully these 12 questions help you. But what do you do when you break trust, or trust has been broken in your relationship? Or how do you, if you realize that maybe there hasn't been some huge offense or fight that has taken place, but it just kind of has eroded away over time, how do you build that up? How do you become someone who is trustworthy, especially in the context of marriage? That's what we're going to talk about next week on Gospel-Centered Marriage. Tune in next week. But let's say our prayer and we'll be dismissed from our class this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, God, thank you again for our marriages, and that at times they are weak and we become distracted. We can allow our failures and our weaknesses creep into our marriage. God, help us to recognize it when it happens. Help us to be humble. God, help us to be forgiving in this vital relationship in our lives. God, when we think about trust, help us to take an honest look at our relationships and our marriages. God, help us to be trustworthy. Help us not to abuse the trust that our spouse has placed in us. Help us to live up to it. Help us to be the kind of husbands and wives that we need to be. God, please be with us now as we enter into this time of worship. God, help us to focus our hearts and our minds on you and who you are, your nature, and what you've done for us. We love you so very much. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen.